At the beginning, the new relationship appears almost flawless. To an outside observer, it can look like a story of sudden happiness and perfect compatibility. The narcissistic woman presents the new partner as though he is everything the previous one was not. More understanding, more supportive, more aligned with her needs. In many cases, this presentation is not just directed at others, but also at the new partner himself. He is placed on a pedestal, admired intensely, and made to feel as though he has entered something extraordinary. Psychologically, this stage is driven by what we might call the power of projection. Instead of seeing the new partner as he truly is, she projects an ideal image onto him. He becomes a symbol of perfection, a mirror reflecting the admiration and validation she desires. For a time, both people may believe in this illusion. The new partner feels chosen, special, even superior to the one who came before. And she feels energized by the emotional attention he provides. But illusions cannot sustain themselves indefinitely. Over time, the small realities of everyday life begin to surface. The new partner reveals ordinary human flaws, moments of disagreement, emotional boundaries, or simple independence. And these ordinary qualities slowly disrupt the fantasy that had been constructed around him. For someone driven by narcissistic patterns, this moment is deeply uncomfortable. The idealized image begins to crack, and the partner who once seemed perfect is suddenly seen as disappointing. What was once admiration can quickly turn into criticism. The same traits that were once praised may now be interpreted as weaknesses or betrayals. This is the point where the illusion of the perfect replacement begins to collapse. The relationship was never built on genuine understanding of another person. It was built on a psychological image. And when reality confronts that image, the structure cannot hold. In truth, the collapse of the illusion reveals something important. When a relationship is built on projection rather than reality, disappointment is not a possibility. It is an inevitability. Once the illusion of perfection begins to crack, something very predictable tends to happen. Rather than reflecting on the relationship with honesty, the narcissistic woman often begins shifting the blame. What was once admiration slowly transforms into accusation. The partner, who was previously described as extraordinary, is now portrayed as the source of every difficulty. From a psychological perspective, this reaction is not random. For someone whose identity depends heavily on maintaining a flawless self-image, accepting personal responsibility can feel almost intolerable. To acknowledge fault would mean confronting uncomfortable truths about their own behavior, their expectations, and their emotional patterns. Instead of turning inward, the mind searches outward for someone to carry the weight of that responsibility. So the narrative begins to change. The new partner becomes too insensitive, too selfish, or too difficult to understand. Small disagreements are magnified. Ordinary human imperfections are interpreted as deep character flaws. The story is quietly rewritten in a way that preserves one central idea: she is not the problem. In many cases, this shift happens so gradually that the partner does not immediately recognize it. At first, he may try harder. He may attempt to correct the issues she points out, believing that if he simply improves himself, harmony will return. But the problem was never truly about those specific behaviors. The blame itself serves a psychological purpose. It protects the narcissistic identity from self-examination. Carl Jung often spoke about the concept of projection, the tendency to see in others what we cannot accept within ourselves. When blame becomes constant, we are often witnessing projection at work. Traits that the individual cannot acknowledge internally are unconsciously placed onto someone else. The result is a cycle of confusion for the partner. He finds himself defending against accusations that seem increasingly disconnected from reality. Meanwhile, the narcissistic individual feels justified, even righteous, in her criticism because it allows her to preserve the illusion of being wronged rather than responsible. And this is the deeper lesson hidden in the pattern. When a person refuses to face their own shadow, they will always need someone else to carry the blame. As the tension grows and the blame begins to circulate, another pattern often becomes more visible. The emotional intensity of the relationship does not fade quietly. Instead, it frequently becomes more dramatic, more unpredictable, and more manipulative. What we begin to witness is an escalation of emotional control. When admiration and validation start to weaken, the narcissistic woman may instinctively reach for tactics that restore a sense of influence over the situation. These tactics are not always loud or obvious. In fact, they often appear in subtle psychological forms. One day there may be affection and warmth, followed by sudden coldness the next. A conversation that seemed calm can quickly shift into emotional accusations or dramatic expressions of disappointment. This inconsistency creates confusion for the partner. He begins to feel as though he is walking on uncertain ground, unsure of what reaction his words or actions might trigger. And within that uncertainty, he may start trying harder to restore the harmony that once existed. He becomes more careful, more accommodating, more attentive to her emotional signals. This is where manipulation quietly takes hold. The silent treatment may appear after a minor disagreement, creating emotional distance that pressures the partner to chase reconciliation. Guilt may be introduced through phrases that imply sacrifice or victimhood, subtly suggesting that he has failed to meet her emotional needs. At times, there may even be emotional outbursts that pull the focus entirely onto her feelings, leaving little space for mutual understanding. From a Jungian perspective, such behavior reflects a deep struggle for control over inner instability. When someone cannot regulate their own sense of worth internally, they attempt to regulate it externally through the reactions, attention, and reassurance of others. The tragedy of this dynamic is that the partner often believes he is helping by giving more of himself. In reality, the more he attempts to stabilize the emotional chaos, the more the pattern is reinforced. And here lies the deeper insight. When emotional manipulation becomes the foundation of connection, the relationship stops being about love and begins to revolve around control. As the relationship continues to deteriorate, another shift often begins to take place, one that is quieter but deeply revealing. While conflict may still be unfolding within the relationship, the narcissistic woman's attention gradually begins to move elsewhere, not necessarily in a dramatic or obvious way, but in subtle psychological preparation for what comes next. At the heart of narcissistic dynamics lies a powerful need for validation. The admiration, attention, and emotional energy received from a partner function almost like psychological fuel. When that supply begins to weaken, when the partner becomes less responsive, less impressed, or more aware of the manipulation, the sense of control begins to slip. And for someone who relies on that external validation to maintain their self-image, this loss can feel threatening. So the mind begins searching for alternatives. This search does not always begin with a clear decision to leave. In many cases, it begins as curiosity, new conversations, renewed attention toward people who provide admiration, or subtle comparisons between the current partner and someone who appears more responsive. What matters is not necessarily the person themselves, but the emotional reaction they provide. The narcissistic individual begins gravitating toward those who reflect admiration, interest, and validation. These reactions restore the sense of importance that may feel diminished within the current relationship. Slowly, the emotional investment in the existing partner weakens, while the possibility of a new source of attention becomes more appealing. To the current partner, this shift may feel confusing. There may be a sense that something has changed, that the emotional presence once felt in the relationship is gradually fading. Conversations become distant, attention becomes divided, and the connection that once seemed intense now feels uncertain. From a psychological perspective, this moment reveals something essential about narcissistic patterns. The relationship itself is often secondary to the role it plays in maintaining the individual's self-image. When that role stops functioning, the search for replacement begins. And this is the deeper truth worth remembering. When someone values validation more than connection, loyalty becomes temporary, and attention becomes replaceable.
As the relationship reaches its breaking point, something interesting often happens in the way the story is told afterward. The events themselves may not change, but the narrative surrounding them begins to shift. What was once described as a meaningful connection is now reframed as a mistake, a burden, or even a form of betrayal. For the narcissistic woman, this rewriting of the story serves an important psychological purpose. If the relationship has failed, the explanation must preserve the same central idea we discussed earlier, that she remains the innocent party. The responsibility for the collapse must therefore be placed somewhere else. Gradually, the partner who once seemed so impressive is now described in entirely different terms. His imperfections are highlighted and exaggerated. Moments of conflict are retold as evidence of his supposed flaws. In some cases, the relationship may even be portrayed as something harmful or oppressive, as though she endured far more than she contributed. This process is not always deliberate in a conscious sense. Often, it is an unconscious form of psychological self-protection. Human beings have a deep need to see themselves as justified in their actions. When reality threatens that self-image, the mind reshapes the memory of events in a way that restores internal balance. Carl Jung frequently spoke about the human tendency to construct narratives that protect the ego. When individuals are unable to confront their own shadow, the parts of themselves capable of selfishness, manipulation, or emotional harm, they unconsciously reshape the story so that those qualities appear in someone else instead. For the former partner, this can be one of the most confusing stages of the experience. The relationship he remembers may feel completely different from the one now being described. He may find himself cast as the villain in a story that no longer resembles the truth he lived through. Yet this rewriting of the narrative reveals something important about the psychology involved. When a person cannot face their role in a relationship's failure, they must reshape the past to protect their identity. And the lesson here is simple but powerful. When someone rewrites history to preserve their image, the truth of the relationship was never their priority, only the preservation of their ego. And once the relationship has finally collapsed, after the blame, the manipulation, the quiet search for another source of attention, and the rewriting of the story, something even more revealing begins to emerge. The pattern does not simply end. Instead, it tends to repeat. This repetition is one of the most important things to understand about narcissistic relationship dynamics. From the outside, each new relationship may appear completely different. A new partner, a new beginning, a new promise of happiness. Yet psychologically, the underlying structure remains the same. At the beginning of the cycle, there is idealization. The new partner is admired, elevated, and made to feel uniquely valued. He is presented as someone extraordinary, someone who seems to understand her better than anyone before. This stage can feel intoxicating, both for her and for the person receiving that admiration. It creates a powerful emotional bond built on excitement and intensity. But as time moves forward, reality inevitably returns. The partner begins to show ordinary human traits: independence, disagreement, boundaries. And once again, those traits disrupt the perfect image that had been projected onto him. What once looked like admiration begins to shift toward criticism. The same dynamic of blame and emotional pressure begins to surface. From a Jungian perspective, this cycle continues because the deeper psychological work has never been done. True change requires self-reflection. It requires the difficult task of confronting one's own shadow, the uncomfortable aspects of the self that influence behavior in relationships. Without that confrontation, the same unconscious patterns quietly guide future choices, so the individual moves forward, but the pattern moves with them. Different faces, different circumstances, yet the same emotional script unfolding again and again. For those who find themselves caught in such dynamics, the most important realization is this: you cannot break someone else's cycle for them. Transformation begins only when a person becomes willing to examine themselves with honesty. And perhaps that is the thought worth carrying with you today. When awareness enters the pattern, the cycle can finally be broken.